All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the crowd that's actually in here. Hopefully we'll have some more that come join us shortly, and thank you to the panelists. Welcome. So the topic, obviously, is regulation in Africa, hardcore or a soft touch. So I want to start off with a very general kind of question. So the brief about this panel, it's up on the website, and includes the note that to be able to provide a favorable climate for investors, regulatory certainty is very, very critical. And I think we heard that on one of the prior panels that was talking about fiber to the small town. And the moderator of that panel asked the panelists a question around what they thought the role of regulation should be. One of the panelists essentially said, ignore the regulator, let's talk about what we as industry could do, which I thought was interesting. And then one of the other ones really focused on the importance of policy certainty to provide broad outlines that are non-changing. So with that in mind, let me open this up to the panelists, but actually before we do that, let's maybe have a brief introduction as to each of you and what is your background and expertise when it comes to regulation. So then with that in mind, we'll come back and talk about what we think the ideal role of the regulator should be. So Jacob, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you, Ellie. Good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Jacob Munodawafa. I come from a regional association of operators, and we are based in Mozambique. My background, I'm an engineer, but I worked a lot for more than 17 years. I used to work for an operator, I used to work for a regulator. So in terms of experience, I know a lot of things in terms of regulation. We set up the regulator in our country, and from there, then I worked for the operator, I moved on now to the regional association. So there are so many things which we need to talk about in terms of how we can shape our industry, in terms of what are the ideal policies, what are the ideal regulations. Thank you, Elaine.
Okay, Leonard?
Thank you, Ellie. My name is Leonard Obonyo from TESPOK. TESPOK is a Technology Service Providers Association of Kenya, the industry association that represents the telecom companies and the ICT companies. I am in charge of research and partnerships. We engage the government in policy and regulatory framework work within the industry. We engage in policy, the country policy negotiations to ensure that the industry is favorable for investors and all the players. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Katarina Pillay, and I work for the South African Communications Forum. It's an industry association, and we have a broad membership, which includes telcos, fixed and mobile, broadcasters, disruptors, vendors, so we serve quite a broad grouping. And before that, I'd worked at a regulator. And while I was at the regulator, I led a process on market consolidation, so I understand some of the complexities around and the pressures around the need for consolidation and some of the investor pressures. And also in terms of transformation, that's a project that I'd worked on at ICASA, as well as developing consumer regulations, which I think is a very critical element in all of this. And before that, I'd worked for an operator. So I've kind of spent a little bit of time in the public sector, followed by being an operator, then going back to public sector operator. So that gives me quite an interesting balance, I think, for this discussion, because it gives me insights into the pressures that operators have as players and the fact that you have to deliver value, but also the public interest point of view from the perspective that, yes, we have to deliver on the public mandate and providing services to the consumer and everything that goes with that.
Yeah, well, thank you for that introduction, because I think one of the questions that we have to be addressing is what's the subject of the panel? What should be the role of the regulator, and how should the regulator be approaching things? Should it be hard? Should it be soft? And it actually comes down to who are the different stakeholders involved, right? I mean, the regulators regulate in the industry on behalf of industry, of consumers, and of other stakeholders in the ecosystem, and of competition law. And obviously, the regulator also doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists under a policy framework of, usually a different government department. So with all that context and with all of your extensive background in mind, let's get to the first question. So what do you think should be the primary focus of the regulator? I know it's a very complex question, so maybe you don't have to pick one, but maybe one or two things. So what do you think should be the primary focus? Should it be infrastructure, service, content, reliability, security, something else, competition, promoting an environment to promote investments? So what do you think, Jacob?
Yes, yes, thank you, Ellie. I think looking at the whole value chain, we're talking of infrastructure, content, reliability, security. I think what need to be the primary focus for our regulators is that they need to create a favorable environment for investment, because the private sector, they need to bring in their money or put their money where they set in the industry. Otherwise, no one will bring their money in and invest. So creating a favorable climate in the environment in our countries is very key. Because now, this year, I know in Southern Africa, the heads of state had the summit in Johannesburg. And the theme for that summit was partnership with the private sector. So I think rolling out the focus is that we need to create favorable investment climate for our private sector investors. And then looking at, in terms of expertise, you find that the operators, that's where the highest concentration of expertise is. And regulators need to put the operators to work. The industry, they need to have an input in terms of policy, the regulations, as proposals, so that now, when they are debated by the whole industry, they become effective policies and regulations. And if it's the opposite side, that's why we end up having challenges where the industry does not accept the proposals, does not accept the policies, because they came not from the industry, but they came from the other side, that is from the policymakers and the regulators. So I think there's a need for engagement with the industry. Operators, the private sector, need to participate in terms of policy formulation and proposals, which will become enforceable by the industry. And then also there's need to things like outsourcing. The capacity in terms of the function of the regulator, they cannot, they don't have capacity, the expertise. So you look at, in some countries, regulators are monitoring, for example, quality of service. They don't have the capacity. So in some countries now, like if you look at Europe and US, that function has been outsourced to the private sector. So they do monitor the quality of service on behalf of the regulator, and the capacity is there within the industry. So there's a lot of opportunities which I think the industry can play a big role in terms of supporting the regulators. And then some of the main key functions like enforcement of the violations, those can remain within the core business of the regulator. So outsourcing regulatory functions is one of the areas I think which can bring a lot of good results for industry, and also adopting transparent processes, because you find that most of the litigation or the court cases challenges which we see in our industry is because there's not transparency. Transparency, in terms of those policies and processes being implemented. There's lack of consultation with the policymakers, with the regulators. So I think this multi-stakeholder approach is very, very important, such that whatever policy, whatever regulation is enacted, it becomes acceptable by all the stakeholders and it becomes binding. So those are some of the issues, Elaine, which I think can help us in terms of making our industry grow and also create an environment where people can invest. And even that discussion which we had before the tea break on how can we roll broadband to the smaller towns. There are so many opportunities once we create that favorable climate. People can bring in their investments, they can grow the industry and create more jobs. So there are a lot of opportunities, I think, which we need to see being played by both parties, the private sector, the public sector, etc. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Leonard?
Yeah, just to add to that, another important aspect which the regulator can focus on is infrastructure, in terms of creating policy and regulations that ensure that the infrastructure is protected in case of an attack, in case of let's say something happens. The infrastructure owned by the entities in the industry should be protected by regulations. And that should be done in a way that it's collaborative. The policy itself should be consultative, multi-stakeholder, in such a way that the industry players take the lead in formulating the policy to help the regulator, so that whatever policy they come out with is just something that will be inclusive. Thank you.
Okay. First, you actually do need a policy, and it needs to be clear. It needs to be, pro-investment. So you can't give people rights and then take it back, which is one of the reasons we have some challenges in terms of the South African context, where when it comes to the licensing of spectrum, as an example, this process started in probably 2005, and it's 2017, the end of 2017, and we still have no spectrum, which has a significant impact on infrastructure. You also need a regulatory environment that's clear, and it needs to address the actual issues and not be exceedingly difficult. But at the same time, it needs both the policymaker and the regulator need to move in with speed, because the reality is not acting under the assumption that you're trying to get it so perfect that you end up doing nothing, is actually worse than making a mistake and correcting down the line, because every day costs people money. So I don't think you can necessarily address infrastructure on its own or services on its own, because the reality is this is a sector that drives the economy. And in driving the economy, you need a combination of things. So you need the infrastructure to be able to access everyone. You then need the content and the services, and the reality is we know that competition happens at the service layer, not excessively at the infrastructure layer because of the investment required. So it's much easier to have a large number of players at the service level. But you also have to have the relevant content and applications to make the services and the infrastructure, to use it to its maximum. So I don't think a regulator can necessarily address one or the other. I think all need to be addressed more or less simultaneously, but you also need to have the necessary measures in place so that people actually can roll it. One of the challenges we've had here is people having access to the road infrastructure. Yes, theoretically you have it, but you still need to get the permitting. The permitting takes a really long time, depending on the city, depending on whether the city is rolling out or not. So you need all of these things addressed. And it doesn't help the consumer when 20 people dig up the road. So you need to have, because the reality is most of the costs lie in trenching. So you need to find a cost-effective way of doing this so that it's also quick and it affects all infrastructure. So I think those are some of the things that the regulator would need to... Sorry, one other thing is the rules need to be adequate to allow for new entrants. It needs to be pro-new entrants, but we also need to stop looking at what currently exists. We need to adopt a forward-looking approach and create an environment for the disruptors, instead of simply looking at what the environment we have right now and trying to only address that. So we need to acknowledge that there may be instances where you do nothing and you simply watch and look at whether you need regulation. Maybe we do, maybe we don't.
Yeah, geez, a lot of information, a lot of complexity. Certainly a broad topic and no simple answers. So I want to thank you guys for all of your thoughts. And along those lines of promoting competition, for my part, I agree with what you're saying, that the industry needs to help take part in putting together what should be the policies and regulations through various different forms, through open consultations and so on and so forth. But I think on the other side, part of the balance needs to be that you can't be having things that are so written by industry that they're written by the incumbents and then it actually prohibits competition and new entrants going in. So there's obviously all these aspects as well. So the next question is, so we just talked about what a kind of ideal scenario would be, or in an ideal world, what a regulator would focus on. So what is the difference between an ideal scenario and how things are currently operating? We're lucky here that we have experience across a couple of different countries. So I'm really curious to see what are the things that each of you identifies as being the real deltas between an ideal world and the actual world in each of your countries. So let's go the same order as before. Jacob, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you, Ellie. I think it's very, very interesting. If you look at, if we borrow from soccer, I know when we all grew up as children, young boys, we used to play soccer at home. We didn't have a referee. We were all players and referees. So I'm not saying we don't need regulators. I think we have moved from an environment where we are now in the digital economy, digital world, where we are talking of converged industry, where it is IP world. And the biggest question is, are our current regulatory frameworks supporting the converging industry? Because the IP world opens up the industry. It crosses borders and boundaries. You end up having operators providing service from any part of the world to any part of the world. So in terms of regulation, it becomes a challenge. So I think this is one of the issues, I think, is what can we do in terms of transforming the current regulatory frameworks within our countries? How can they meet the current requirements so that investment in terms of broadband, investment, like we're talking of focus on fiber to the home, how can we accelerate this investment? Because we had a presentation by one of our colleagues from Vodacom where he talked about being very close to the customer. So there's a need for these small players who are very close to the customer, and they provide the much required attention to the customer. And I think this is one of the areas I think which we need to look at, if in terms of licensing. Do we need to license all the players, all the providers? I believe we don't have to. The licensing should only be focused on the bigger players who are producing wholesale services to the industry. But the smaller players who are very responsive to the customers in the villages, in the smaller towns, they should be given the authority or the business opportunity to provide the end services, because the competition is more on the service area than on the infrastructure. So I think it's one of the areas where we need to really look at in terms of how can we transform our current regulatory frameworks to encourage investment, to encourage more players to play in the downstream value chain of our businesses. Because we are providing our customers with high-speed broadband to the house, to the building. But who is now going beyond in that value chain into the house, into the building, to provide those services which are required by the customers. And one interesting area I think we have talked about a lot is to do with the OTTs. The internet currency where these players are playing their part is because the IP world allows anyone to provide service. And then in terms of regulation now is how do we regulate the industry in this converged environment? I know right now I think in Europe, there's a proposal that there's a need to relook at the whole framework in terms of how can we regulate the whole industry in terms of the value chain. Was you end up having an operator maybe coming from resident in Japan, but that operator is not subject to the laws in some parts of our countries, but the service is available in our countries. So that brings complexity, and that requires us to relook at how can we bring a fair play in terms of the level playing field. And then in terms of innovation, how do we make sure that everyone has got access to innovation? Or do we allow the innovation only to be enjoyed by a few players in the industry? So I think in terms of the ideal scenario, the industry can only grow if we let it if we allow collaboration, partnerships with the industry. I think many speakers, since the morning, they talked about collaboration, co-building networks. avoiding duplicate networks. So I think it's very key that we look at the industry. How can we foster these partnerships? How can we encourage investment into the sector? And I think, Elaine, these are just some of the points which I wanted to raise in terms of what is the ideal scenario in terms of regulation, and what can we focus on, what can we look at in terms of how we can transform the industry. Because if you look at our region, for example, Africa, at the moment, much of it we are on the receiving side. The technology which we are adopting is being developed somewhere else. And I remember the previous presentation said the density of households in South Africa is very, very small as compared to other countries. And it gives a challenge in terms of the cost. The cost goes up. So the question is, how do we look at that technology? How do we transform it? How do we interrogate it, make sure that it meets our requirements? So those are some of the issues, I think, which we need to look at the industry together with our policymakers and the regulators in terms of how what we bring in the technology to our region meets our requirements. Thank you, Elaine.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. We have a challenging region in that our costs, if the equipment we buy is priced the same as it is in dollars and euros, the same as it is in other economies, and we have, on average, lower incomes, less money to spend, and larger geographical distances, it's kind of a perfect storm in terms of challenges. But I think this comes back to the point you made earlier as well, which is that the regulation doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? So you could have things like tax incentives and so on, where your policy could actually speak to some of these things, but it's a much broader playing field than just what the regulator can do. So, Leonard, would you like to?
Yeah, I would like to say that there's also a thin line between what is ideal and what is actually happening right now. Because of the changing needs of the environment, what was ideal yesterday might not be ideal today. What is ideal today might not be ideal tomorrow. So it just depends on the needs of the industry, and that's what changes the market. Yeah.
So to that point, what are you seeing in Kenya at the moment? What do you think is the biggest opportunities in terms of where the regulator is now and what the industry needs now, and what's an example of a gap?
The Kenyan case, in the past, the regulator used to take the hard stand where they would come up with regulations and impose on the operators. But as time went by and innovation came through, the regulators are more cooperative, more consultative, and more collaborative with the industry. Now you find they now take a softer stand and a softer way of approaching the regulation.
So it sounds like Kenya is already moving in a good direction.
Yeah, actually in a good direction. And in fact, most of the time they let innovation take the first step and then they follow. You don't overregulate before the innovation.
Interesting. All right, so Katarina, I'm sure you'll have some interesting things to say about the difference in your mind between the maybe ideal state for a regulator and the actual state.
I think one of the biggest challenges we have is we keep trying to do the same thing we've always done. And we still, in some ways, regulate in the same way that we did when you had a monopoly. You had one player, so you needed lots of regulation. Now you have more players, so do you still need the same amount of regulation? In environments with less rules, we seem to have seen better results. A simple example is, if you look at fiber, there have really been fewer rules, but you do need collaboration and you do need somebody to help with the rapid deployment because it's difficult to get permitting. But at the same time, you were able to cover significant areas. And we also need to bear in mind that this is an environment that increasingly has high costs. The reason that it increasingly has high costs is because, in terms of the input costs, a lot of the equipment in this sector has to be imported. And when it's imported, like you said, they're dollar prices. And we're affected by the fluctuation of the rand. So that has a significant impact. And we are in an environment where there's increasing pressures on pricing, that operators have to roll out more at a higher quality of service, and they must provide more and more at a lower cost. It's the only environment that happens. They often have very little control over the factors, in terms of the import costs, the equipment, those sorts of things. So if that's what we have to deal with, are we regulating the right things? Are we looking at the right issues? Are we, and also we seem to have a tendency that the loudest voices get heard the most. So you have the policymaker, you have the regulator, then you have operators. And where does the consumer fit in this? Everybody else knows what the consumer needs, but there's no real consumer voice in this. And I think that's a very important thing that needs to come in. Like in the South African context, we don't typically have an active consumer voice. When I was at ICASA and we were doing consumer regulations, it was actually very difficult to get consumers involved. So you have manufacturers telling you what the consumer needs, you have operators telling you, and of course, as the regulator, you decide you know what consumers need. And as part of trying to involve consumers, and they need to begin to realize that they have a role to play. We tried to attract comments on Facebook, we tried to make it easier in terms of submissions. None of that really worked. What did work was going out to have community meetings, essentially. Then people would come in, they tell you their problems, and so that was one way. But I think it's very important that regulation takes into consideration the growing, input, the cost of inputs, and the fact that you have to drive down prices. If you look at the South African context, we currently have a campaign called Data Must Fall. And we have 3 different regulatory processes happening all at the same time. So we have the Competition Commission that started an inquiry with an interesting terms of reference that already knows the prices of data is high, but they're going to still determine that. But they know the answer in their terms of reference. Then you have ICASA that's doing an inquiry on pricing. So they're looking at different markets. Data could possibly be one of those. But at the same time, they've also published a regulation or draft regulation for comment that imposes significant obligations. So if you're running 3 processes to address pretty much the same thing, that has a cost. If you impose additional obligations that you're trying to, bring down prices, but you're telling an operator you have to now build systems, and you have to do this, and you have to do that, and you have to do that, but it's not evidence-based, what exactly are we trying to do? Shouldn't we be listening to the consumer? Shouldn't we be gathering that data and then trying to address the problem as opposed to simply deciding that the price is high, but we're going to continue to add to the regulatory burden and the compliance costs, and then we're going to say, drop the price. How does that happen?
Yeah, and let's also not forget that, to your point as well, that the regulatory requirements are often one size fits all, right? So telecom has to apply, it has to do the exact same things as a small operator who's operating in one little municipality. So that obviously increases the costs because you have diseconomies of scale for the smaller kinds of entities, and that then also discourages competition.
Yeah.
So
I think to add to what she said, it's also the role, in an ideal situation, it's also the role of the regulator to educate the consumer on the regulations. And also, as you gather information from the consumer, they also educate the consumers, not only to focus on the operator, but also the consumer.
yeah, and I think it is, the consumer is usually the party that's missing when it comes to these gatherings as well. We have vendors, we have operators, we have sometimes policymakers and regulators and so on, but obviously we are, as members of industry, we are also consumers, but then I think that's a very important point, that voice is really missing. And how do you actually represent, because the consumer is probably the most important stakeholder. And if any of us here in the room have ever had a consumer complaint with an operator, well, what do you do? Because I can tell you sometimes it's very difficult to follow the normal tech support channels, right? And if you happen to know someone, you can call them, but that doesn't work if you're a normal consumer. And then how about the complaints procedure with the regulator, right? I don't know if anyone's actually gone through such a thing. So anyway, it's complex. So before we move on to other things, let's come back to the subject of this actual panel. So regulation in Africa, should it be hardcore or a softer touch or somewhere in the middle? What's your take on that question? Actually, let's reverse the order. Let's start with you, Katarina.
somewhere in the middle, I would say. Because what's the point? We need to take a step back. What's the point of regulation? We're trying to create competition, or we're trying to mimic competition. So if there's competition in the market, shouldn't we be looking at, is that competition effective? Find innovative ways. The simple example is, in the South African context, we don't really cater for their consumer choice, in the sense that I may have a limited amount of money, and I may be willing to buy a lower grade of service for a lower rate. Our regulatory environment doesn't provide for that. What it does is, it's got a pretty good standard of service. A pretty good standard of service or grade of service comes at a significant cost, because that's something that we need to consider, that if we're saying we want ubiquitous coverage, which we do, and we want it at a high level of a high grade of service, that comes at a cost. So what are we trying to do when we're saying we want affordability? So how does this, we've got lots of rules about lots of things. That comes with compliance costs as well. So I think somewhere in the middle to, softer touch regulation, regulate the things you have to regulate and leave the rest to the market.
Well, that actually kind of begs the question about the difference between a hard line and a sandbox, right? Because you can have a framework for a regulation where, for example, because to that exact point, do you want a higher level of service? Are you willing to pay more, right? So rather than saying you must do this, actually leave it open to the market, subject, of course, to other protections and the ability to have disclosures around getting, what exactly you're paying for at the different price points.
Can I just add to that? What ICASA tried to do in its consumer regulations was try to create an environment where the consumer is more informed. So instead of trying to impose additional penalties and fines and things like that, what you really wanted to do is you create a more informed consumer base, so that, and there's more information that must be made available to the consumers, so the consumer can then choose. Maybe we should allow competitive advertising or something like that.
All right, Leonard?
Yep. I think a more middle stand is more ideal, where the regulations foster effective competition in the market, but also protects the interest of the consumer. Like I said, it's important for the regulator to also take the interest of the consumer and also educate the consumer on the regulation. If you take a hard stand of imposing the regulation, you might end up regulating something that's not even there, or something that does not need the regulation. So it's important for the regulator to ask, is there a need for the regulation, first of all?
Or again, potentially, maybe not one size fits all, right? You could have certain things that you do take a hardcore approach on because they're important, and other things where it's a bit softer.
Yes.
Yes, I think looking from the economic point of view in terms of development of the country, if you look at those countries which are leading, ICT, they're taking it seriously. If you look at Korea, Japan, US, Europe. So I think in terms of regulation, it should be supportive in terms of development of the sector. And like our colleague Katarina talked about the issue of penalties. We don't need penalties in our industry. I think we need a softer approach in terms of regulation. Because hard approaches, they bring many problems, legal challenges, interpretation of the laws becomes a problem. So I think soft approaches, creating innovation, enables investment by the private sector. Because the private sector plays a key role in terms of developing new networks, new services. And so that's why I think I'm saying, like my colleagues, soft approach is ideal for industry. And apart from protecting the consumers in terms of their interest, I think the role of the regulator is to make sure that the industry grows and transforms our economies. Because ICT cuts across all the sectors. Today, we are talking of FTTX, fiber to the home, to the building. We're talking of 5G. But what are we doing in terms of transforming people's lives? Because once you give a customer fiber to the home, is there going to be a change in terms of their lives? But somebody was saying, you bought me an iPad, Daddy. You bought me a laptop, a computer at home. But why am I still going to school? I want to do my studies at home. Once I get fiber to the home, I want to go to hospital. I want to have all my services from the house. So those are some of the things I think which we need to look at in terms of how can the regulators support, the innovation, the development of new services to support, the economy to grow and become competitive.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to start this next question, also going to direct it from that side back, because this one, we had an earlier panel where we were talking a little bit about, in South Africa in particular, the facilities leasing regulations and some of the challenges around the actual enforcement of that, and then just operators themselves either trying to be good neighbors or sometimes not being as good neighbors. So I think if we can generally accept, I think that the general consensus seems to be that infrastructure sharing largely makes sense. Not digging up the same street 6 times by 6 different operators generally makes sense. It's lower cost, it's less disruptive, it's all of these good things. So if we, first of all, feel free to question that if you disagree, but presuming that you do agree, to what degree should how should a regulator try and, using this one practical example, how should a regulator try to encourage this sort of behavior, right? Because again, you could take a hardcore approach to say, thou shalt, and thou shalt not, or you could take another approach which encourages industry to work together or, outlines broader ways of, softer ways of getting that done. So I'm going to, again, start with Katarina, because South Africa, I know at least has regulations that are meant to be doing exactly this, and I'm not actually sure about Kenya and Mozambique and other places.
The approach fundamentally is infrastructure sharing, and whether you're sharing a mast or you're sharing the trench, it doesn't matter. But surely it makes commercial sense, because if you look at rolling out a tower, it comes with a significant cost. There are significant delays in permitting. It's the same thing when it comes to digging up the trench. So there must be a commercial imperative as well, but I think we have to acknowledge that the regulator isn't always adequately capacitated to deal with some of the infrastructure sharing disputes that have come before it. There's a long delay, and I think the long delay could have various reasons. Part of it's capacity, and I don't think it's necessarily expertise. I think it's also capacity from a human resource point of view. And also, the information's not as forthcoming as we think it is. So perhaps there could be an alternate mechanism that helps alleviate the disputes, because that's really what the issue is. And there's no independent verification of whether there is capacity or not, because very often, I suppose the rules are not clear enough.
That was one of the comments earlier, that they seem they're not clear enough, and then people they interpret them differently, and as a result...
Because, for example, I have a tower, and because it's my tower, of course, I have the prime site. But you're my friend, so I have space for you in a good spot in the tower. But he's not my friend. Jacob's not my friend. So, there's no space in my tower, and then what do you do? It's the same thing about the trenches. So is there capacity? Well, if I want to give you capacity, and then it becomes a problem. How do you prove what one is saying over what the other is saying? And I think there's no proper mechanism to help for the regulator to be able to assist in determining that.
Or also, by the way, just from the point of view of providing an end-to-end quality of service for an operator, maybe I don't think your tower's built sufficiently. Maybe I don't like the way that you trench, and I don't actually want my infrastructure in there because I feel it's actually going to be detrimental. I'd really rather build my own where I know the quality end-to-end, even of that physical passive infrastructure. So I think that's another area as well where if there was regulations around, for example, minimum standards and then the certification of certain builds of certain sorts of critical infrastructure, you might be able to have less of that. Because even if you've built your tower perfectly, I may say, I don't think you've built your tower perfectly. I'm going to put up another one, right?
But I don't think that's necessarily the trend that we see in the South African context, because we have an operator that doesn't have any towers. They use other people's towers. We've seen transactions where operators have tried to use each other's towers. They've even gone as far as trying to use each other's RAN networks. So I think there is an increasing drive to share infrastructure, but I think it depends. I mean, obviously, if it's a competitive issue, then, it depends. And I think it's really a matter of resolving these disputes much faster.
Yeah, and I think that's very true, at least in South Africa on the tower side, but I think the fiber side is a little bit different, and then certainly other countries are going to have very, very different situations. All right, Leonard, your thoughts?
My thoughts are on fiber and the trenches. In fact, infrastructure sharing is definitely the way to go, but sometimes I think there's always a disconnect between the government agencies, the government agencies dealing with the constructions of the road and the regulator. Because the roads are built very nicely, especially in Nairobi. Then after that, people start digging to put the trenches. Why don't the regulator and the other government agencies collaborate so that when they're building the roads, the trenches are built and everyone just leaves space in that trench and it becomes easy.
Or what prevents the municipalities, instead of trying to run their own networks, that they just simply trench, because that's the highest cost.
Yeah.
So you trench as part of the utilities that any municipality or province has, and people just allow them to lay the cable.
Yes.
Because that's their business, that's their core business. Yes. Your core business is utilities.
Yes.
Well, now you're opening a very interesting door, which is what should be the role of the regulators in regards to municipalities offering telecommunication services.
I think developing standards along, the regulator can develop standards for municipalities along those lines.
Yes, I think that's a very, very important point, because we as an association, representing the industry, we pushed for a policy adoption by the ministers of SATA that any new infrastructure, roads, dams, houses, buildings should be approved if there's no civil works or passive infrastructure for fiber. This was adopted 2 years ago in Swaziland by the ministers. And it's a policy sitting at SATA level. But the problem we have seen is the domestication of the policy by the member states. No one is doing anything. We are seeing new highways being built, but there are no pipes being laid on the sidelines of the roads. We are seeing new pipelines for oil, for water, but nobody's laying the ducts for fiber. So the policy is there, but the problem is implementation of that policy. No one is doing it. It was adopted in Swaziland by the ministers themselves, and we pushed for that policy that any new infrastructure development should be ICT ready. Our colleague from Vodacom talked about it, the issue of codes, the business codes and access. That you have a new estate, well built, but there's no ICT provision. And then, like he's saying, 2 months down the line, here comes the good guys, they're now busy digging. So I think we need to do something about this. The policy is there, but who's implementing it? So I think there's a need to bring almost everyone on board, the municipalities, and so that that policy can be implemented and we all benefit from that policy.
Well, the implementation is one thing, but then one of the other questions I was going to ask is what about the enforcement of the policies and the regulations, right? Because the policy's there and the regulation's there, but it's not being done, that is actually an enforcement challenge. And obviously we all know regulators have challenges in terms of resources as kind of minimum. So let's unpack that one a little bit. How best can or should a regulator enforce the existing regulations? Who wants to take that one?
I think, like you are saying, explaining, enforcement is also is a challenge in terms of capacity, because if you look at our government structures, most of them they stand in silos. They don't collaborate. I remember when I was working in one of the operators 15 years ago, we were developing ICT infrastructure under the Ministry of Telecommunications and ICT. And then our other Ministry of Energy, they were doing their own business, also developing infrastructure for ICT. But we're not talking to each other, just because there were 2 ministers who didn't also talk to each other about ICT projects. So government money coming from different pockets, but being spent in the same country. So it's a challenge.
Well, you have that in corporates too.
Yeah, so that's a problem of implementation of policies. The policy is a national policy adopted at the regional level. Domestication is a problem. So I think the best way is to escalate it to the highest level. That we need a political will from the, from the highest level that let's adopt this policy, let's implement it.
So I think Leonard and Katarina, I mean, if you guys can answer this, but I guess the question would be, is there any one thing or a couple of things that are really so important that a regulator should take a hardcore approach to actually enforcing specific things? Because again, the mandate is so broad, there's so many things, you can't enforce them all. Given limited resources and given limited political will, what should a regulator focus on enforcing and how do they best do that?
I think regulations that are going to lead to expanding the market and benefit to the market. Those are regulations where they can take a slightly harder or stand that ensures the market is effectively competitive to ensure that all players are not necessarily the same, but of course, because of different resources, but all players are taken care of in the industry. Yeah.
But what about the poor consumer?
Yeah, consumer interest is very important too. Yeah.
But did you hear that interesting response? Because it's so typical of the way we do things, either as the regulator or any sort of framework that's done. It's yes, this is our plan, we know better. We're going to hear from players in the market. Oh, and by the way, we're doing this all for the consumer, but they don't have to talk for themselves. We'll remember you somewhere down the line and we'll think for you. I don't think that's a good approach. I think we have to find a better mechanism to have consumers involved in, but consumers also equally have to take responsibility. In South Africa in particular, we just don't have that kind of society. We complain about some things because somebody has started a campaign for whatever reason. And then sometimes we get behind it, sometimes we don't. But we don't take an active role, and it's your responsibility as a consumer to make that voice heard, I think.
Yeah, which I understand and accept, but sometimes it's difficult. I mean, as you yourself pointed out, if you want to complain about, suppose I want to complain about my bank, other than my bank, where do I go? I suppose I could find the banking regulator, but then to find the consumer line, and then what's the likelihood I'm going to get a positive response? I think a lot of people just don't bother. But I think this is an area where potentially all regulators could take more and more efforts to be able to open up those channels and publicize them further, so that people understand. Because if you don't want to speak into a black hole, right? You at least want to feel that you've been heard, even if nothing happens immediately.
Should it just be the regulator that has a role to play, as it all players? Everybody in the environment should be equally, this is consumer protection is a non-competitive issue. So there needs to be collaboration between the players in the market and the regulator, and there's enough awareness created about it. Because, I mean, if you think about the South African context, there was a big bang when the NCC came in, and it's kind of like died down considerably.
And I suppose that's another thing as well, is that if you have a complaint, you may not even know what's the appropriate regulator, right? I mean, suppose that now POPI comes into effect next year. This is the Protection of Personal Information Act in South Africa, for those who are maybe not from South Africa. But suppose that I discover that my ISP has shared my personal data. Who do I complain to? Do I complain, as a consumer, I may not even really recognize. It's not my job as a consumer to know what regulations apply to the companies I'm doing business with. So it's a challenging thing.
Do you want me to respond?
Well, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Like, suppose that you're a regulator and you get a consumer complaint that's not even related to your area. What do? Do you pass it on to the other regulator? Do you kick it back to the consumer? What do you do?
It is a very complex environment, because if you think about it, if you look at it just from, let's use mobile as an example. If I'm a mobile consumer or subscriber, then I would complain about billing to ICASA. But I would complain about my handset to the NCC, and each element of that value chain goes, some of it goes to ICASA, some of it doesn't. As a consumer, it's very difficult for you to know. So my advice when I was at ICASA was, lodge your complaint with ICASA, it's easier, you know where to go. And if it's the wrong regulator, they have an MOU with the NCC, so they will direct it, and then there's a tracking mechanism. It's not ideal, but there is a tracking mechanism, and there are time frames. And ICASA's timeframes in terms of consumer complaints resolution is very competitive. I mean, if you look at other regulators around the world, their timeframes are pretty good.
Okay, so I have just one more question, and this one is about what your thoughts are on regulations around disclosure, right? So there's a couple different, I mean, there's many different aspects to the regulation. We talked about infrastructure, service, and so on, but two particular examples to pick on, and you can comment on another one if you can think of one. So the first one is back to this trenching and digging. So I have a friend who works for a landscape business, and he was recently complaining. He said, hey, you know, we just put in this landscaping outside someone's house, and then a week later, a telecoms company came and dug up everything. And yes, I mean, they have to restore it, but it's difficult to go restore landscaping if you're digging up shrubs and so on to how it was. And he was saying, surely they knew, surely they had dig plans, surely they could have, I mean, they knew what street it was going to be down, surely they could have at least posted on the post boxes, hey, we're going to be digging the street sometime shortly. So that's one example. And another one is something, because again, as people in this industry, we're all familiar with some of the different terms and what to look for when it comes to choosing a service provider and choosing a package. But a lot of people they just want internet. They want it to work. They want it to be cheap. So things like, for example, looking at contention ratios. I mean, like I see all the time, whether it's a mobile LTE product or a fiber to the home product, they'll advertise these headline speeds, and they'll advertise, it's like speed price. Those seem to be the two important things. But obviously, the same speed isn't the same depending on what sort of contention ratio you have or what else is going on in your network. So what are your thoughts around what sort of a role the regulator should play in encouraging and or mandating disclosures, whether it's to consumers or property owners or other kinds of key stakeholders? What should a regulator ideally do? Jacob, why don't you start?
Yes, thank you, Ellie. I think in terms of regulations, these projects are planned well in advance, usually a year in advance or 2 years. So I think there's a need to advise, especially, for example, if it's civil works that, for example, the homeowners associations are advised well in advance, a year in advance, that there's going to be a project in the area, and this project involves digging in front of your houses, and the contractor, they'll make sure that whatever they've excavated, they'll bring it back to the original state. So those are some of the things, I think, in terms of the regulations which need to be in place and be enforced by our regulators. Like, she gave an example. Where I come from at my house, I had two companies. One company came and dug, they put the fiber, past my gate. Then 2 months down the line, another company came again, they dug and put the fiber. But they never restored the original landscaping. Until today, when it rains, the soil dips down. So those are some of the challenges, I think, which we face as customers or users. And I think landscaping, there's need for enforcement, that wherever anything is dug, they need to replace what was there, whether it was some concrete or it was some pavement, etc. And then the issue of disclosure, for example, the issue of speed. What most ISPs sell to customers is because they say, okay, I give you 10 meg or 20 meg internet. But they don't disclose in terms of where does that 20 meg end. Because usually when they sell you bandwidth, it only ends up with their node. What happens in that cloud, nobody knows. And then the customer now is watching a movie on YouTube. The link from the ISP to YouTube, maybe you've got 1,000 customers, there's congestion on the network, or on the submarine cable. Customer complains, I'm not enjoying my service. So I think the issue of disclosure is very, very important to our customers in the contract, that what we are selling you is so much, but that bandwidth is up to this node. Beyond that node, it's a network of networks, because the internet, in most cases, is the best effort network, where the packets, they take different routes to the destination. So it's not that when I give you 20 meg, it's all 20 meg to the US, no. So those are some of, I think, like you are saying, customers need to be informed and also educated about what are they buying exactly.
You know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of when you buy a car, the car tells you how many miles or kilometers per gallon or per liter you're expected to be able to get in terms of your fuel or your petrol. Actual mileage may vary, but it was years and years ago where some consumer commission somewhere, possibly in the US, said, hey, let's actually put in place some sort of a standard around this to say, according to, here's the rules for the road test. And then everyone has to publish the same standard. Because at the end of the day, I don't care if it's 100 meg to what. I care about what's my actual expected average speed over the course of a month, given normal, whatever that may be, and there's different kinds of profiles as well. The same as you have like someone who's going to be driving a race car versus someone pottering around town. Anyway, Leonard, your thoughts?
Disclosure is important for both consumers and other operators because it helps everyone prepare if you want to do a rollout. But sometimes the challenge can be when there are disputes. The disputes might end up taking a long time to resolve. Partly, the regulator takes time to resolve the dispute, and it delays the rollout and the plans for the investor. Yeah.
This is a punt for my former employer. But in terms of the consumer regulations that ICASA has, they actually attempt to do that, to introduce transparency, where when somebody contracts with an operator, the operator at the point of contracting has to give you a whole lot of rules about, they have to tell you a lot about whatever service you're buying. So it would be the rules about when they can increase prices, whether it can happen midterm, not, what the pricing is. One of the shortcomings I do see in that regulation is there's nothing explicit about the speeds. I guess that was never part of the commentary and this is where the consumer voice would be useful. So, there is a drive towards transparency because that's actually so important. It makes life so much simpler for the consumer as well as for the operator if there's greater transparency, because then you are buying something that you actually know and understand, and you can make better decisions based on your specific needs. But your question about the disclosures in terms of trenching and things like that, I think that's the role of the municipality because that doesn't fall within the sector regulator. But then again, when you have a multiplicity of entities that are doing the regulation, so is it yours, is it mine, who does it? It should just be a simple rule that you can't come and put a pole outside my house and run
Run an ugly wire.
Exactly, without having a process where I know what you're doing. So in the same way, when you're digging up a road, just like you have to tell me when you're cutting my electricity or water supply, similarly, you have to tell me you're digging up the road.
Yeah, that was a comment made earlier that telecommunications are actually a form of utility. Yes, it's private, and yes, there's many of them, but it is a form of utility. So actually, that's a very good point. Utilities have disclosure requirements. Mail something to me, stick it up. Give me a couple of weeks' notice.
But that's again where the consumer comes in. The consumer should be complaining, and complaining really loudly, because it's really, really annoying when you're driving and then you get a hole in the road because people. And I don't think it's the larger operators, or maybe it is, I don't know. But it depends on the specific standards that they are held to, because some service providers don't necessarily do that. When they restore the road, they never restore it properly.
Yeah, define restoration, right?
Yeah.
Well, I could keep talking about this all day, but I think that we're probably towards the end of our session. Do we have time enough to open up to questions from the audience? No? One or two questions. Someone in the audience want to pose a question to the panel? I think we have one here. Could we get this man a mic, or can you just try and speak? Here, Mike is coming to you.
I'm Duncan Martin, retired, so not blamable for anything. I wonder why regulators feel the need to represent the end user. It seems, what I've understood from what you're saying is that your job is to promote competition in the industry. The consumers may not speak to you, but they send you messages through their choices of suppliers and their churning from one supplier to another, and the failures of suppliers who didn't offer the right sort of services. So it's not clear to me that regulators have that there's a requirement for the regulator to explicitly feel they must consult the end user? Thank you.
Would you like to comment on that, Katarina?
I believe the regulator has a role to play, and it's not just about promoting competition. Yes, that's one of their roles, but consumer protection is another clear role, and it's explicit in the legislation that governs this environment. So it would be very difficult for you to do consumer protection without speaking to the consumer that you're protecting. So what exactly are their concerns? You would actually be assuming or assimilating what those concerns are. I don't think you can effectively do consumer protection without speaking to the person that you're trying to protect. And you need to have some sort of broad framework in terms of those rules or rules for conduct that operators need to comply with, which is what you have. And I think there's a growing trend, like in other countries, like Belgium as an example. What they do is they've relaxed the things like penalties, and they say, okay, if you don't want to provide a service, you go back and tell the consumers you're not going to provide that service. It's the same thing that ICOS has done with its regulations, where it says, okay, we won't give you such a high fine, but you go back and tell the consumer that you didn't comply. I think that is a much, much harsher thing to do, because no operator or licensee is ever going to want to go back and say, well, I was supposed to have done X, Y, and Z, but by the way, I didn't do it. That is a better carrot, as it were, to encourage performance than it is to fine somebody.
Yeah, well, good luck even getting a small company to admit they did something wrong. Doesn't happen very often, right?
But they're processes.
Yeah, but it is actually an interesting point, because there is actually a wealth of information. I was attending one of the pre-workshops yesterday, and there was a gentleman talking about data and how data can be used to improve businesses. And at the end of the day, it all comes down to what questions you're asking and for what purpose you're collecting this data. But it's actually an interesting idea, because there's a wealth of information that's not being collected, which is when people sign up for a service, why are they signing up for this service from this operator? And then when they leave, why are they leaving? And it's usually not just one thing, right? But then it's not a simple answer. How do you go collect that, right? I mean, an operator could decide proactively they want to start conducting consumer onboarding and exit surveys, and then using the data. Because I mean, some of that could be, numerical surveys. Some of it could be actually fill in an answer. And people who are sufficiently unhappy will usually be very verbose as to why they're unhappy. But then to be able to, that theoretically someone could make a regulation to say everyone must collect this. But then again, that puts a huge burden, especially on smaller businesses. I don't know if anyone has any comment on that. I'm just talking out loud.
You need to always balance whatever obligation you place on the licensee in terms of what you're going to get out. Because the more you add, like your example, it's a nice example, but they have to build systems. And when you have to build systems, you have to gather the data, you have to be able to analyze it and make it available. In order to do that, that comes at a cost.
And again, it's a disproportionate cost the smaller the company. Jacob, Leonard, do you have anything to add to either to the original question or to this conversation we've been having?
Yes, I think the issue of incentives, like she has explained, that I think we don't need penalties in our industry. I think a well-formulated strategy will result, I think, in a shared, win-win situation, both for the operator and also for the consumer, because penalties will not achieve or give us any desired results. I think we've seen them, being given to many operators in many countries, but in the end, they didn't achieve. The results were not the intended. Not the results. So I think we need to look at what are the strategies and what do we need to achieve, and like what I've seen in other countries now is that, in terms of, for example, monitoring quality of service, the regulators have got systems where they are monitoring, but automatically the output of those systems, they are feeding to the operator's network as well, to the call center or the operation center. So whatever they see as bottlenecks in terms of quality of service, automatically the operator, they have to adjust their network or optimize the network. So those incentives are working in many countries. So we don't see any penalties happening being issued with operators anymore in those countries. So I think there's need for shared strategies where both the operator and the regulator they work together in terms of improving quality of service, for example, when you monitor our networks, and also it results in a better service for the customers.
All right, Leonard, anything you want to add?
Just to conclude, I think it's the role of the operator also to educate the consumer on the regulations, because most of the consumers out there, they don't know the regulations. When something happens, they don't know where to turn to. So if they educate the consumer, it makes work easier.
Is there any other? Okay, no more questions from the audience. We've reached the end of our time. So I would like to thank all of the panelists, and it's been a really interesting conversation for me. I think we've uncovered a bunch of very interesting topics, and I guess it's now time for the wrap-up and cocktail hour. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.